Hello YouTube, this is Noyes of Productions, and welcome to this episode of the Godzilla Vlogs, where we talk about anything and everything Godzilla. I had an interesting conversation with somebody recently about the horror genre, and then I started looking online, and blah 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 blah, and suddenly I read this interesting article, or this interesting thing that somebody wrote. It was just a guy just kind of blogging, talking about, is Godzilla, the original Godzilla, the one made in 1954, the Japanese version, a horror movie? Now, everyone sort of throws Godzilla into two genres, and these are the two genres that genuinely fit Godzilla as a whole. One is the science fiction genre, and rightfully so. Most of the Godzilla films, I feel, do fall into the science fiction realm, hands down, no questions asked. And the other one is the kaiju genre, but let's be honest here, and I know some of you might not want to hear this, but the kaiju genre isn't really a genre. It is a subgenre of science fiction. I call films the kaiju genre, but the mainstream people don't even know what the fuck a kaiju is. I mean, luckily, because of films like Pacific Rim, it started to kind of get into the mainstream lingity, but it's not really, it hasn't really been embraced yet, which is fine. It doesn't really matter. It's just a genre, after all. But does Godzilla actually fit into the horror genre as well? And I actually have to say yes. Yes, it does. And there's a multitude of reasons why. And actually, the fact that it also fits into the horror genre is something that I think makes the original Godzilla stand out from every single other Godzilla movie ever made. The original Godzilla, I believe, is the only film to ever kind of branch out, not just from science fiction, but go into another genre, and that is horror, as I've just stated previously. And that's what makes it stand above all the other ones. You can kind of debate me that some of them are fantasy, like GMK, for example, but that has a lot of science fiction elements in it as well. Well, really, that'd be kind of like the only one to really step outside of science fiction and kind of go into fantasy, though I still consider that movie more of a science fiction film than anything else. But the rest of the Godzilla movies are just, I think, almost pure sci-fi. Almost pure sci-fi and pure kaiju madness. And that's the fact that the original Godzilla really, truly steps also into the area of horror that kind of stands out. And I was looking at like things that kind of level out like what defines a horror thing, and I started looking through it and I was like, yeah, the Godzilla really fits there, Godzilla really fits there, and Godzilla really fits there as well. You know, for example, and I need to kind of explain what type of horror I'm talking about. I'm not really talking about modern horror. Modern horror is garbage. It is disgusting, it is stupid, it is nothing but for teenagers, and I think there needs to be a revolution, basically, in the horror genre. But I'm not really talking about slasher, though slasher does kind of fit into what Godzilla does. I mean, slasher films, of course, is literally something is going out and killing people left and right. John Carpenter's Halloween really kind of revolutionized that kind of thing. And we certainly have elements of that in the original Godzilla, especially with the fact that you see a lot Godzilla just killing people left and right, like literally deliberately killing people, and that certainly does kind of fit into the slasher genre. But the slasher genre wasn't a thing yet, and even though Psycho was the one that kind of really brought it about, you know, that's kind of generally accepted, it still didn't become a thing until the 1970s. But I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about kind of like classic horror. And if you want to know good examples of what classic horror is, watch the original or the really old 1930s and early 1940s Universal films, like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Invisible Man, so on and so forth. Those are classic horror movies. And I was looking at those films and so on and so forth, and they do have a lot in common with the original Godzilla. Something that horror kind of does is horror kind of takes something kind of realistic, right? Something kind of realistic and kind of twist it into a cinematic sort of form. And like, for example, in the original Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein's monster killing all these people. In the original Godzilla, it more falls into the realm of him actually killing all these people, either deliberately or not, during his rampage in Tokyo, when he's out at the sea, so on and so forth. You get what I'm talking about. Another thing that really kind of set those movies out above all the other ones, or those kind of horror movies, is that oftentimes these old horror movies would kind of have all these low-key lighting. Not like noir, right? Not kind of like noir, but still like kind of like these harsh shadows. Usually some fog in there as well. In fact, the lighting can actually, now that I'm thinking of it, be compared to film noir, but a little bit less dramatic than film noir. That is very much so in like a film like The Wolfman, where every time the Wolfman is walking around, there's all this fog, and you see the moonlight shining down from the sky. It's very ominous, very atmospheric. The entire film for Godzilla is full of that kind of high contrast kind of lighting. Even the stuff that's outside, you have a lot of whites and a lot of darks. And that's not just with the film print. The entire film is really colored like that. And it really comes out specifically in the scenes that deal with Dr. Serizawa in his little kind of castle up on a hill. Which plays into another thing that makes this really fit into a horror movie genre. And that is, a lot of early horror had kind of some sort of mad scientist. Maybe not mad in the sense of, like, oh my god, I'm going to kill people, but more in the sense that he's really questioning his humanity. That is definitely, the best example is Dr. Frankenstein from Frankenstein 1931. He's definitely questioning his humanity, like him creating his monster in general. Is that moral, is it not? And oftentimes this character kind of plays the human element of the film itself, either that or the monster, which certainly fits in with Godzilla. With Dr. Serizawa's castle, well, it's not really a castle, but it's very gothic, very much reminiscent of even the laboratories in Frankenstein, for example. Very low-key lighting, very harsh. There's kind of like almost like a mist throughout the room to give it even more kind of an edginess. It very much so fits into that category. And Dr. Serizawa very much plays that mad scientist realm. He's certainly the person who's questioning, you know, his humanity and everything, because here's a person who is genuinely trying to do good for humanity, just like Dr. Frankenstein, but in the end accidentally creates something terrible. I mean, Dr. Frankenstein created the monster, beautifully played by Boris Karloff, and Dr. Serizawa created a weapon, but they still kind of gel together, but in different ways. While Dr. Frankenstein is directly tied with his monster, and Dr. Serizawa isn't tied with the monster of the movie, he's tied with a weapon that very much so stands in for like the nuclear bomb, and because of that, it's very much so the juggling back and forth, what is right and what is wrong. That very much so fits Dr. Serizawa. That mad scientist very much so fits Dr. Serizawa. He's very much so caught in the realm of, should I do this or shouldn't I? And in the end, he takes his own life to make sure that the oxygen destroyer, what he created, is never used again. The other thing too is that oftentimes the horror films back then in the classic genres usually had something of a metamorphosis or something of something unhuman. Something maybe humanoid but unhuman. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, the Wolfman, even Creature from the Black Lagoon, even though that was much later, all had kind of like these humanoid kind of creatures. The key thing here was that these are creatures and things that oftentimes they even kind of seek a mate, or they seek something to kind of fall in love with, usually a woman. That definitely happens in Creature from the Black Lagoon. That happens in the sequels to Frankenstein, and so on and so forth. In Godzilla, you don't have that. You have the creature for sure, but you don't have it. In fact, that actually makes it even more terrifying, is the fact that Godzilla in Godzilla 54 does not have any sort of human ties whatsoever. It is literally just a walking atomic bomb, which in a way makes it even more frightening than, let's say, a movie from Beast, or the monster from Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Which in that movie, if you compare the two destruction sequences, The dinosaur in Beast from 20,000 Fathoms kind of is walking through the streets. It's not really destroying anything. It eats a couple people and steps on a couple cars, but it wasn't really destroying anything intentionally. That's the key. Intentionally. Not intentionally. And in Godzilla 54, Godzilla is destroying things deliberately and ruthlessly. And he shows absolutely no remorse towards anything that is thrown at him or anything that he kills. He is, as I've said earlier, and as the director wanted, is a walking nuclear bomb with no emotion, no anything. Which is kind of funny, because another thing that happens in the horror genre, the classic horror genre, is that oftentimes the audience, we the audience, feel sympathy towards the monster in the end. King Kong is my favorite example of that. How, he's kind of like a rampaging monster throughout the entire movie, but towards the end when he's getting shot, you feel genuine sympathy for him. And then my second favorite example of that is Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein's monster, you just feel so horrible for and so much sympathy for, because he's not a monster in a sense. I mean, he is a monster, especially in his physical appearance, and this is why Boris Karloff beautifully plays him. But he's still got some human elements to him. For example, the scene where he's playing with the girl, it's very touching, but then all of a sudden he can't differentiate between, what isn't alive and what is, and that's why he throws her in the pond and ultimately kills her. And we feel bad for Frankenstein's monster at the end of the movie. He's been backed into a corner and he's reacting to it and ultimately dies in the process. The same way towards Godzilla. Despite the fact that he has killed thousands of people, and we've seen a lot of it on screen, and he's destroyed Tokyo and countless others out to sea, we still feel sympathy for him when Dr. Serizawa lays down the oxygen destroyer and we see Godzilla writhing in pain. Because you really start realizing at that point the next thing in which the horror movie genres really play at, and that is the monster is made from mankind's arrogance. The monster is usually created because of us pushing humans pushing their boundaries too far in either nature, science, or anything of that kind of thing, even religion. And that's the embodiment of what Godzilla is. Godzilla was created because we were tampering with atomic bombs and we were nuking them left and right. Our arrogance led to the reawakening of this giant monster, then it wound up lashing back. Some people have even interpreted Godzilla's attack on Tokyo as him defending himself, him being afraid and lashing back. Some people have credited it as that. I don't personally see it that way, but I really understand why people do, because it's a very animalistic thing to do. Something that beautifully is portrayed in the original Frankenstein. I know I'm comparing those two quite a bit, but they kind of fit together the most if you really look at it compared to all the other ones. A lot of these kind of movies would often have kind of like a voice of reason versus like a voice of pure science, or a voice of, I guess I was right, sort of like pure science. In Frankenstein, for example, it is definitely, let me see. In The Wolfman, it's, Lon Chaney Jr. is concerned, it's Claude Rains' character. Is it Claude Rains? Pretty sure it's Claude Rains. It's Claude Rains' character, for example. And then in the original Godzilla, you have Dr. Serizawa, who is debating his humanity, and then there's Dr. Yamane, who very much so is the voice of science. And then you have a character like, I'm actually going to say Emiko, who actually is the voice of reason throughout the thing, because not only does she promise to keep the oxygen destroyer a secret, when she sees everything that happened because of Godzilla, she spills the beans. For the greater good, essentially. So she is kind of the voice of the heart, the voice of the emotional sides of humanity. Another thing that you'll see a lot of old horror movies also do, specifically, is have something tied to legend, have something tied to some kind of fable. For example, in The Wolfman, it is, the whole thing with the gypsies, talking about the werewolf, and the whole thing with the cane and everything, so on and so forth. That's the kind of fable of the story. In Dracula, there certainly is a fable of you don't go up to that castle, but the guy goes up to the castle anyways, and he gets fucked. In Godzilla, it is the people of Odo Island, very much more kind of reminiscent of King Kong, for example. King Kong is another great example of there being kind of a legend behind the monster. On Odo Island, all these people are praying to Godzilla and trying to figure out, you know, what's going on with him, and they know what he is. To them, he is a god. And in some ways, I think that actually had to go into the Americanized titling of Gojira and everything. They took the term God and put it into Godzilla. I don't know where they got Zilla from, but whatever. But those people were looking at Godzilla as a god who has attacked before, though before their time. And he's the reason why all their fish are going away. When really it was both the atomic bomb and Godzilla himself. And they are the people that kind of warn everyone of, you know, the threat that is Godzilla, and the science people don't really pay any attention to it until they start connecting the dots later on. That happens in The Wolfman, for example. They don't really believe in the werewolf until the werewolf attacks Lon Chaney Jr., and then Lon Chaney Jr. starts turning into the Wolfman. In Godzilla, no one really believes in the old man who's saying it's a monster until the monster actually attacks. See where I'm going here? Everything is kind of connected into the horror movie realm. Another thing you will also hear in a lot of these sort of old classic horror movies is oftentimes the lack of music and their use of music at the same time. For example, if you watch the original Frankenstein or the original Dracula, they have hardly any music in them whatsoever, and especially in Frankenstein, that works beautifully. While in a movie like The Wolfman, there's almost kind of like a Mickey Mousing kind of score to it, where it underscores, there is literally a score throughout almost the entirety of the film. Godzilla does something that's kind of a hybrid of that. What Godzilla does is it takes a lot of these moments that are actually very important and leaves them completely silent, leaves out any music whatsoever. But then all of a sudden when something needs to kind of like punch home, that's when Akira Ifukube's music comes in. A great example of this is actually during Godzilla's rampage itself. There are several key like bridges throughout the attack that just go completely silent, only to then fade into music when some strong destruction stuff actually happens. There's some great shots of the city burning, the city on fire, that are just utterly silent, and all we hear are the sound effects of the flames. That stuff is absolutely wonderful. An example of that done extremely well is when the character in the original Dracula with Bela Lugosi, when the character arrives at Dracula's castle and goes in, there is almost no sound effects whatsoever. And it is very, very creepy because of that. Because they knew that there shouldn't be any music there, and there's some things with sound that also played into it, but they shot it very creepily to make you feel uncomfortable as you go in there. They did the same thing on Godzilla. And for example, when Dr. Serizawa brings Emiko down into the basement to show off the oxygen destroyer for the first time, there's hardly any music that plays in that at all, not until the actual oxygen destroyer goes off. And you can even debate that when the oxygen destroyer starts going off, that's even actual soundtrack. Sure, it was actually composed by Akira Ifukube, but that could also stand in for an actual sound effect of what the oxygen destroyer is doing as it opens up and starts eating all these fish. That's something else that kind of brings into the horror genre. Horror movies in general take things that are just absolutely horrific, that our imaginations can dream up. That's one thing that I actually like about the horror genre, is that oftentimes they take what our imaginations can kind of conjure up, and oftentimes actually put it into the film. In The Wolfman, for example, it is some maulings that happen. In Frankenstein, it doesn't necessarily have to be gory. In the original Frankenstein, it is the monster actually killing the kid, the little girl. In the original Godzilla, for example, it is done much more in your face and much more on the gory side. For example, when the oxygen destroyer, when you see it actually eat the fish alive, just kills them, that's utterly horrific. Then there's other scenes that are very reminiscent, and actually they punch home even more the fact that a lot of these shots are very reminiscent of the hydrogen bomb, or footage from the hydrogen bomb, and also footage of the fire bombings of World War II. And what I mean by that is, if you look at a lot of video of us bombing Tokyo and the fire bombings, there are stories of people hiding in a refrigerator, and when these people found the refrigerator, they actually had to be scraped up. Their skin had actually melted into the walls of the refrigerator, and they had to be removed by a shovel. You actually see some pretty nasty stuff in Godzilla. People getting burned alive, people getting trampled, buildings falling on top of each other. The most horrifying one is the great example of the mother holding her 3 children, saying, "Soon we will be with Daddy in heaven," as the sparks that fall down just get more intense and more intense and more intense as the scene goes on. It's very horrific. That's very horrific and very ballsy for that, but that very much so fits the kind of bodily horror that fits a lot of the horror genre. I have rambled on enough. So go on Facebook, like AN Productions for up-to-date information about what we're doing here. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment saying how much of a retard I am or how awesome I am. It doesn't really matter. I read them all and respect them all. Like the Godzilla saga, which I'm still writing, and we're getting close to completion. You can even now go on YouTube and watch my latest feature film, Which Way They Walk, which is kind of a film noir film. It is up in full, and I hope you would like that and watch it in support of independent film. And join Geeks for Geeks. If you're a geek and have some stuff you want to show off or some stuff you want to discuss, this is definitely the group for you. It's a very tiny, small group, very tight-knit though, and we all are good friends and we all have fun. So go join that if you'd like. And in the end, this is Adam Noyes of AN Productions saying, sayonara.